Good morning. Today is the 29th of Sivan and the 18th of June. We're now starting a new Parshat Korach. Just so that you're aware, in Israel we are one Parsha ahead. We're going to be reading Chukat this week. This week is also the third day of Tammuz, which is the day of passing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's always related to Parshat Chukat. So actually, in outside of Israel, it's Parshat Korach, which is an interesting combination. In any case, let's get down to what this parsha is about. So everybody knows that Korach was a cousin of Moses, and he was the head of not the head, but one of the most important Levites in the Kehat family, the eldest family of the Levites, and they were entrusted with carrying the vessels of the tabernacle when they traveled. So let me just read a tiny bit from my translation, which I recommend to everyone if you're learning Parsha in English. So it's called the Kahot Chumash. It looks like this. It's a series of 5 books, and it's put together by the person who actually started Rav Ginsburg's organization Galei Nai. His name is Moshe Vishnevsky, and he did a phenomenal job here, which is, if I haven't talked about it, if I haven't heralded and praised it before, then I should now. It's a work of art, probably one of the best books put together in the past 10-20 years, and it includes everything that the Rebbe ever said about any verse or Rashi in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses. And it also has in-depth insights in Chassidus, and just a lot of very important information that goes directly into the translation. I can put a link up in the chat a little bit later, and you can take the link from there and maybe order it if you're interested. So let me just read a little bit from the translation. After the episode of the spies, Korach figuratively betook himself aside, breaking away from Moses' authority. Korach's lineage was impressive. He was Moses' first cousin. The eldest son of Yitzhar was the second son of Kehat after Amram, who was Moses' father, who was in turn the second son of Levi. His lineage back to Jacob is not mentioned here because Jacob prophetically saw that this rebellion would occur and prayed that his name not be mentioned in it. Korach felt that since the 2 sons of Amram, Moses and Aaron, had assumed the highest offices of the people, leader and high priest, he should be next in line for honor, since he was the son of Amram's next brother in line, Yitzhar. When Moses, acting on God's orders, appointed the son of Uziel, Amram's youngest brother, to the position of prince of the Kehat clan, Korach was incensed. He led his rebellion with his own sons, together with his neighbors Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliav, and On, the son of Pelet. The latter 3 were all descendants of Reuben, who camped south of the tabernacle, next to the clan of Kehat, who also camped south of the tabernacle. They confronted Moses together with 250 men from the Israelites. The group included the 12 princes of the congregation summoned for the assembly, but it was made up chiefly of the heads of the courts, men of repute, most of whom were from the tribe of Reuben. They all assembled against Moses and Aaron, dressed in wool robes dyed turquoise, and asked if such a garment required tassels, meaning tzitzis. Moses answered in the affirmative. They mocked his answer, saying that if attaching a tassel with a single thread dyed turquoise to a garment not dyed turquoise, and that makes the garment permissible to wear, shouldn't a garment made itself, all of it, of wool dyed turquoise be permitted to be worn without a tassel? By this they meant to imply that since all people are holy, there is no need for special leaders. They said to Moses and Aaron, "You take too much honor upon yourselves for the entire congregation. All of them are holy, as evidenced by the fact that they all heard God's voice on Mount Sinai, and God is in their midst. So why do you raise yourselves above God's community?" On the face of it, though, in the translation he makes it a point that they are challenging Moses' appointment of Aaron as the high priest, And it seems that that's what Korach wants. He wants to be named the high priest, or he should have a different high stature. But it seems to be mostly against Aaron. But in truth, this was, like we just read, a challenge to the leadership. But not just to leadership, Moses as leader. It was a challenge to the entire concept of leadership. Why should there even be hierarchy in a people? Why should society be divided by a hierarchy that should be leaders and people who lead and people who follow? It should be that everyone should be equal. Now this sounds awfully like anarchy in a certain sense, where everybody is equal. But the premise here is not anarchistic. The premise here is that, like we said, since everybody heard God's voice at Mount Sinai, since we're all holy, we should be able to govern ourselves without there being a leader. We should be able to get along and to cooperate without needing someone to lead us. So that's the usual understanding of Korach's dispute, that he wanted to create a reality in which leadership was not needed, and that no one would feel that they were higher or better than anyone else. But I want to take a different look at it and explain that the way that the Rebbe looked at it, and then as we go through the week, we'll go deeper and deeper into this understanding, into how this is explained according to Kabbalah and Chassidus. So there's a famous thing that's brought, that the Rebbe brings in the name of the Noam Elimelech. Noam Elimelech was Rebbe Elimelech of Lizhensk, and he was the, one might say, the great emissary of Chassidut, of the Hasidic movement in Poland. And he brought the Baal Shem Tov's teachings to Poland and basically founded that entire branch of Hasidic thought and following. And he writes that the translation of the words Vayikach Korach, that Korach took himself, as it were, is that Korach separated himself. In Aramaic, the word is itpalig. And itpalig means he separated himself. He set himself aside, like we just said. But it's not just he set himself aside in the sense of I'm separate, I'm distinct, but I am separate, I am distinct, and therefore I am contentious. I am against the other side. I am, by necessity, upholding what we call an argument, a dispute, a machloket. The Rebbe says, according to what Noam Elimelech says, that the whole issue was actually much, much more basic. It's not just a question of hierarchy in general. It's the question of whether it is even possible to make peace in the world. The sages say that before Moses gave the Torah, brought the Torah down from Mount Sinai, before God came down on Mount Sinai and he gave the Torah, there was a separation between the supernal worlds and the mundane worlds. The separation was such that they say that those who belong in the supernal worlds could not come down to the mundane, and those who belong to the mundane could not ascend to the supernal. In other words, if you're an angel and you are spiritual, you have no business here below. And in fact, there were examples, according to the homiletic understanding of the Torah, of angels that descended down into the mundane world and therefore lost their stature. They weren't able to sustain their spiritual stature in this world. But the opposite was also true, that human beings, the creatures that belong to the mundane, could not ascend to the spiritual realms. And what that meant was that if you were born part of the material mundane world, you could not mix into your life the spiritual. Now, it's a very interesting thing that we just came out of the story with the spies, and they basically argued something very similar. They came and said that we don't want to go into the land of Israel because that will require us to take our spiritual, supernal existence and degrade it and bring it down into the physical, and therefore we will lose it. Because there's no real way to mix the two. And usually when you talk about most of the religions in the world, that's the way that they see things. That the person who wants to dedicate himself to the spiritual cannot be connected and attached to the physical life at the same time. You can't have a family, you can't have children, and so on. And it took a long, long time until some of the religions came to an understanding that maybe it is possible. But they're not to blame, because common sense says exactly that the two things are separate, that you can't really combine them. And I think we mentioned it, I'm not sure if we mentioned it last week, I mentioned it somewhere, I teach in other places, that there is this famous statement in Christianity that says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to the church what is the church's. Meaning, you shouldn't try to mix the two, because they don't mix. The whole premise of God coming down on Mount Sinai was that, on the contrary, even though the common sense approach is that they don't mix, the true sense of what God wanted when He gave the Torah was to mix them, was to bring the supernal down into the mundane and lift the mundane up to the supernal. Korach wanted to maintain the separation. He didn't want there to be a difference, a way to mix the spiritual and the physical. He wanted them to be on equal footing, but separate. He wanted them to be equally important, but separate. And so therefore, in a certain sense, what he was doing was, he was making the separation between heavens and earth stronger than what it was meant to be after the Torah had been given. What does that actually mean? That he's not against Moses being the leader, and he's not against Aaron being the high priest. He just doesn't think that they should meddle in the mundane affairs of everyone else. Everyone else who is more mundane, who is more connected to the material world, should lead themselves in their own way. And they don't need to mix the two. And in fact, if you take someone who's too spiritual and you tell him, okay, can you lead the people now? The answer is invariably, it's not a good idea. Because the person who is too spiritual will not be attuned to the needs of those people who are material. But again, the purpose of the Torah is really to reach a different state. And the state is such that even the most material person, even the person who is dealing all day long with material needs, with crops, with today he has a factory, or he's programming, or whatever he's doing, he still sets aside time, and he has to take responsibility himself for his spiritual well-being. He has to elevate himself. He can't count on someone else doing the spiritual work for him. He has to go pray every day himself. He can't hold by the fact that someone else is praying for him. He has to study Torah himself, and so on. And the same thing is true of those people who are immersed in the spiritual. They have to have a hand and a foot in all the mundane matters that are going on in the world. They have to understand where people are. They have to understand where the generation is. They have to understand what the problems people are encountering are. And they have to take part in that and immerse themselves, partly at least, in those problems. In fact, if they're really doing their job, the spiritual people, those who have an innate connection to the spiritual, every time that they're learning, every time that they're praying, they're constantly focusing on how this can be an aid to someone who doesn't know what I know. There was a very famous rabbi in Israel who passed away about I think 12 years ago, Rabbi Eliashiv, and he was famous for having an answer for anything that anyone asked him. But the answer wasn't just an answer like he would just think it off the top of his head. He'd invent something. Rather, he'd immediately quote a passage from the Talmud. He said, "This is the answer for what you're asking." And he was asked once, "How do you connect them so fast?" He says, "When I learn the Talmud, at the end of every passage, I ask myself, sort of like Jeopardy, and this is an answer to what question? What question could somebody possibly ask me about their life that would be answered by this particular passage?" And so that was his way of connecting his learning constantly with this mundane reality that most of us are in, most of us are grappling with, and to get a spiritual answer to come down to our level. So as the week goes on, I hope we'll be able to go deeper and deeper into this idea of separation, of dividing the world into two parts. And it's actually, now that you understand, it seems to be in the beginning that this is the opposite of not wanting hierarchy. It seems that hierarchy is actually having divisions. So we'll have to reconcile those two ideas also as the week goes on. Thank you very much for joining. Hope to see everyone tomorrow. Tonight is the first of the month of Tammuz, the first day of Tammuz. Have a Chodesh Tov, a good month for everyone.